Amidst all the excess and grandeur of noble feasts, one quiet revolutionary was laying the foundations of modern French cuisine. Guillaume Terrel, better known as Master Guillaume, served as chief cook to no less than 3 French kings: Philip VI, Charles V, and Charles VI, between 1326 and 1390-5. Master Guillaume's reputation was such that he was placed in charge of organizing the coronation feast of Charles V in 1364, which featured a staggering array of 66 dishes divided into 3 courses. But his greatest triumph came years later, during a diplomatic crisis that nearly erupted into war. In 1378, King Charles V found himself hosting a particularly delicate dinner for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV and his retinue. Relations between France and the Empire had been strained over territorial disputes, and the slightest diplomatic misstep could have resulted in bloodshed. The pressure on Master Guillaume was enormous. The meal had to be spectacular enough to impress the imperial guests while subtle enough not to appear boastful or threatening. Guillaume spent weeks planning every detail of the feast. He understood that food was a language of its own, capable of conveying messages of respect, power, wealth, and cultural sophistication. Each dish was carefully chosen not only for its flavor, but for its symbolic meaning. The evening began with a procession of subtleties, elaborate edible sculptures that told the story of French imperial relations. Through culinary art, the first depicted Charlemagne's coronation, reminding all present of the historical connections between France and the Empire. It was crafted entirely from spun sugar, marzipan, and gold leaf, standing nearly 3 feet tall and requiring 16 assistants to carry into the hall. But the true masterpiece came with the main course. Guillaume had acquired a pair of live swans, birds associated with both purity and nobility. But instead of simply roasting them, he had them carefully skinned, cooked, and then redressed in their own plumage so they appeared to be swimming on a lake of blue-tinted aspic. Hidden inside each swan was a complex stuffing made with ground peacock, almonds, saffron, and exotic spices that had cost more than most nobles spent on clothing in a year. When the swans were presented to the high table, they appeared so lifelike that several guests gasped in amazement. Then, in a moment of theater that Guillaume had rehearsed for days, the swans' beaks opened to release small mechanical songbirds that flew around the hall, singing before returning to perch on specially placed golden branches. The emperor was so delighted by this display that he stood and applauded, declaring that he had never witnessed such artistry in all his travels. The tension in the hall evaporated, replaced by genuine admiration and good fellowship. Diplomatic negotiations that had been deadlocked for months suddenly became cordial and productive. Guillaume's success at this dinner established his reputation not just as a cook, but as a diplomatic artist. Kings began consulting him not just about menus, but about the political messages their entertainments might send. His cookbook, La Viandière, became the first text to seriously discuss the relationship strange things people did for fun in medieval times. Boring History for Sleep. Hello there, dear listener. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me on this journey back in time to explore the curious world of medieval pastimes and entertainment. Wherever in the world you happen to be right now, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, or the witching hour, I invite you to make yourself comfortable. Let your cares melt away and allow my words to paint vivid pictures in your mind's eye. As you settle in, I'd love to know where on this big blue marble you're tuning in from and what time of day it is in your little corner of the globe. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy calm, quirky storytelling that brings history to life in an immersive way, I humbly invite you to subscribe so you never miss one of our soporific sojourns into the past. But you needn't trouble yourself with any of that right now. The only thing you need to do is relax, breathe deep, and let me gently transport you to a time long ago when life was very different than it is today. A time of castles and kings, peasants and plagues, chivalry and superstition. A time we call the Middle Ages. The world of medieval entertainment. When most people think of the medieval period, they often conjure up images of hardship and drudgery. And it's true. Life was no picnic for the vast majority of people during this era, which roughly spanned from the 5th to the 15th century. It was a feudal society where a small noble class ruled over a large peasant population. For the average serf toiling in the fields or the apprentice plying his trade, each day was a struggle for survival. But even in the face of war, disease, oppression, and backbreaking labor, the human spirit endures. And medieval folks, just like people in every age, found ways to cope with their lot in life and escape. However, briefly into the realms of joy, revelry, and entertainment. Some of their diversions would seem rather familiar to us, while others range from utterly bizarre to the downright dangerous. So come, let us leave the 21st century behind for a while and discover the wild ways that lords and ladies, knights and knaves, jesters and maidens tried to inject some fun into their hard-scrabble lives. The Grand Tournament. Circuit one of the grandest and most iconic forms of medieval entertainment was the tournament. These elaborate martial competitions were a way for knights to showcase their combat prowess, impress the noble ladies, and climb the social ladder. But beyond that, they were hugely anticipated events that offered a splash of color, excitement, and pageantry for people of all classes. Tournaments typically took place on large fields outside of towns and lasted for several days. Imagine the scene. Rows of colorful tents and pavilions housing the competing knights and their retinues. Banners and flags bearing coats of arms fluttering in the breeze. Vendors hawking refreshments and souvenirs to the gathered crowds. The air crackling with anticipation and the clamor of people, horses, and armor. The stars of the show, of course, were the knights themselves, the medieval equivalent of professional athletes and celebrities. Clad in gleaming armor, adorned with colorful silks, they put on quite the spectacle as they paraded around the arena on their majestic war horses. Sir Edmund the Bold, a tournament legend, one knight stood head and shoulders above the rest, both in renown and tournament prowess. His name was Sir Edmund the Bold, and his story reads like something straight out of a storybook. Born the youngest son of a minor noble in 1146, Edmund was effectively an extra mouth to feed. So his father did what many nobles did with their surplus sons in those days. He essentially donated young Edmund to the church as an oblate, but the rowdy Edmund was not cut out for the contemplative life. As a youth, he was more interested in brawling than praying. Lucky for him, his talents caught the eye of an influential nobleman who decided to train him as a knight. It proved a most fortuitous decision. Edmund took to the knightly arts like a fish to water. But what truly allowed him to make his mark was his daring prowess on the tournament circuit. In an era when nobles often had to pay huge ransoms if they were defeated in battle or captured, the money that could be won at tournaments offered an attractive alternative. And Sir Edmund the Bold was very good at winning tournaments. Contemporary accounts claim he emerged victorious from an astonishing 500 jousts. That's quite the win record, even if it might be exaggerated. But there's no doubt Edmund was the Michael Jordan of the medieval tournament world, a figure of reverence and renown. A one-man spectacle who drew huge crowds whenever and wherever he competed. His success in the arena translated to success at court. Over his long life, Edmund would serve as a right-hand man to no less than 5 English kings, most notably King Richard the Lionheart and his brother John. He remained a paragon of loyalty and wisdom. Through reigns and rebellions, intrigue, and outright war. by the time he died in 1219. He'd risen from humble origins to become one of the most powerful and respected men in the realm, the Earl of Pembroke and Lord Protector of the young King Henry. The big third. The Chalon Tournament Incident 2. Really get a sense of what these tournaments were like at the height of their cultural dominance. Let's zoom in on one especially famous, or perhaps infamous, competition that took place in 1274. The setting was the northern French region of Chalon, and the key players were the brash English Prince Edward, who would later be crowned King Edward I, and the Count of Chalon, a French nobleman. According to one contemporary account, the trouble started when Edward showed up at the tournament grounds with an entourage of no less than 200 knights. The sheer size of his retinue was seen as an arrogant power move by the French hosts, who were used to being the big cheese at their own tournaments. The Count of Chalon took particular umbrage at the perceived slight. Things came to a head on the tournament pitch in front of a crowd of thousands. One of Edward's men emerged victorious in his joust against the Count's son, which must have really rankled the French lord. Heated words were exchanged, and before anyone quite knew what was happening, the Count of Chalon charged at the prince himself, lance lowered. Bad move. Edward deftly dodged the blow and quickly got the better of his hot-headed attacker. According to one witness, the prince grabbed the Count around the neck, threw him off his horse into the mud, and struck him with his fist between the shoulders so that the noise of the blow was heard by those standing far off. Talk about a royal rumble. The humiliated Count slunk off to lick his wounds, while Edward basked in the cheers of the crowd. It was the kind of dramatic confrontation and astonishing feat of arms that made tournaments such electrifying spectacles. The noble art of the hunt for the nobility, hunting was far more than a mere pastime. It was an elaborate ritual imbued with deep symbolic meaning. A successful hunt was seen as a demonstration of masculine prowess, a way for lords to bond with their peers, and even a metaphor for the triumph of order over the chaos of the natural world. Lady Isabella's fatal passion, but perhaps no one embodied the spirit of the medieval huntress quite like Lady Isabella of Burgundy. Born into the immensely wealthy house of Valois in 1457, Isabella was the only child of Charles the Bold, the pugnacious Duke of Burgundy. With her father often away waging war, Isabella grew up under the strong influence of her mother, Margaret of York, who instilled in her a lifelong passion for hunting and falconry. Contemporary accounts describe Isabella as a lively, free-spirited young woman, equally at home in the saddle or the great hall. She scandalized the Burgundian court by insisting on riding astride like a man rather than demurely side-saddle. Her favorite horse was named Tempest, and the two were inseparable companions. Isabella's education was remarkably well-rounded for a woman of her time. In addition to needlework, dancing, and music, she learned horsemanship, archery, and how to train a falcon. By all accounts, Isabella was a crack shot with a bow and a skilled huntress. One chronicle boasts that she could shoot a hare at full gallop. Her enthusiasm for the hunt was so great that she often neglected other duties. A court scribe laments how council meetings were perpetually delayed because Isabella was off somewhere with her beloved birds and dogs. Isabella's prized falcons were lavished with the finest accoutrements befitting their royal status. Their jesses, the leather scraps used to tether them, were made of silk brocade or Moroccan leather studded with gemstones. The birds' hoods, used to keep them calm, were intricately embroidered with gold and silver thread and adorned with tassels and bells. Some hoods were even topped with miniature crowns. The tragic end, but for all her skill and courage, no hunter can outrun fate. Isabella's own story would be cut tragically short in 1482 when she was just 25 years old. In a terrible twist of irony, the Duchess who so loved to hunt would herself fall victim to a hunting accident while pursuing quarry with her falcons near Bruges. Isabella's spirited horse Tempest tripped and fell, throwing her violently to the ground. Isabella suffered devastating internal injuries and lingered in agony for several days before finally succumbing. Her inconsolable husband, Maximilian of Austria, whom she had married for love, a rarity among royals, was at her bedside until the end. With her dying breath, Isabella asked that her heart be entombed with her beloved Tempest. Lady Isabella of Burgundy's untimely death sent shockwaves across Europe and altered the political landscape as her rich territories passed to the Habsburgs. But among the people of Burgundy, she was remembered as a free spirit who lived and died pursuing her passions. Tales of Isabella and her faithful Tempest riding to the hunt would be told for generations, a stirring tribute to a remarkable woman. The art of falconry, while most medieval women did not enjoy Isabella's freedoms, many did take part in hunting in their own ways. Noble ladies often rode out with the hunters, not to chase game themselves, but to watch their men demonstrate their skill. They acted as cheerleaders from the sidelines, their cries of encouragement or derision echoing through the glades. Some high-born women kept their own hawks and even trained them, although on a much smaller scale than Isabella's grand establishments. These pampered birds served more as living accessories than fierce hunters. A noble woman might carry her little Merlin on a velvet cushion or perch it decoratively on her wrist as she processed through the garden, its jesses and hood color coordinated with her gown. Even the clergy got in on the hawking craze, to the consternation of many. Bishops and abbots were some of the most ardent hunters, often neglecting their spiritual duties to spend hours in the field. Some even brought their birds to church, perching them behind the altar during Mass. One can only imagine the chaos that must have ensued when an agitated hawk decided to take flight in the middle of the service. The Mongol connection, but while falconry may have been born on the battlefield, it quickly became the favorite pastime of the elite from Morocco to Mongolia. The Arab caliphs and Persian emperors kept elaborate mews filled with hundreds of birds and an army of falconers to tend to them. Falcons even found their way into Islamic art and literature as symbols of nobility and grace. The Mongols, those hard-riding nomadic warriors that swept across Asia and Europe in the 13th century, were also avid falconers who brought their love of killer birds with them as they conquered half the known world. But perhaps the most famous falconry aficionado of the Middle Ages was a woman who met a tragic end doing what she loved. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a medieval falconry influencer, was so obsessed with his birds that he wrote a whole book on the subject and was known to bring his falcons to church with him perched on his arm. His contemporary, Kublai Khan, grandson of the infamous Genghis and ruler of the Mongol Empire at its height, was using falconry for more practical purposes, namely, training his birds to take out enemy soldiers on the battlefield. The Mongols weren't content with just conquering most of the known world on horseback. They had to get their birds in on the action. Medieval festivals and fair days provided a welcome respite from the daily toil and troubles of medieval life. All over Europe, from mighty London to quaint villages, people looked forward to special festivals and saints' days that promised feasting, revelry, and wonder. The Burgundian Carnival, one of the most raucous and eagerly anticipated of these, was Carnival, the indulgent period, preceding the austere fasting of Lent. Carnival celebrations date back to ancient pagan festivals, but in the Middle Ages, they took on a distinctly Christian flavor while still retaining an air of mischief and mystery. For a few fleeting days, the normal order of society was turned on its head. Perhaps no rulers embraced the spirit of carnival with quite as much enthusiasm as the Dukes of Burgundy in the 15th century. The Burgundian court was renowned across Europe for its opulence, artistry, and pageantry, and the Duke spared no expense when it came to Mardi Gras. In 1454, Duke Philip the Good staged an extravaganza in the Flemish city of Lille that was remembered for generations. Against a mesmerizing backdrop of torches, tapestries, and flowers, Nobles cloaked in luxurious costumes paraded through the streets, accompanied by musicians, marching soldiers carrying pikes, and elaborate floats depicting religious and mythological scenes. Crowds of common folk jostled for a glimpse of the exotic animals, like camels and elephants in Philip's menagerie. Fountains flowed with wine as onlookers scrambled to fill their cups. Troubadours and poets performed ballads regaling the Duke's chivalry and might. And as night fell, a lavish banquet commenced in the Duke's palace, featuring a dizzying array of delicacies like roast peacock, candied violets, and sugary sculptures. The climax came when Philip made his grand entrance dressed as a woodsman, the torchlight glinting off his cloth of gold. Before all the assembled nobles, he solemnly vowed to take up the cross and embark on a crusade to recapture Constantinople from the Turks, a pledge known as the Feast of the Pheasant. Though Philip never actually fulfilled this oath, his carnival vow exemplified the dreamlike splendor of Burgundy at its height. The boy bishops of England further. North in England, a rather different carnival tradition emerged, the election of boy bishops. In a playful inversion of church hierarchy, young boys were chosen to lead religious services and even deliver a sermon before the grown clergyman on Holy Innocents' Day. This peculiar custom, recorded as early as the 10th century, became widespread and was practiced in many of England's great cathedrals and monasteries. One can only imagine the bemused faces of the worshippers as a nervously grinning boy gave a squeaky-voiced homily, dressed in outsized bishop's robes and mitre. More rambunctious was the similar tradition of appointing a lord of misrule, a mock king who presided over the feast of fools and other carnival revelries. Usually portrayed by a young layman, this impudent character was tasked with stirring up mischief and laughter, turning convention on its head. The Lord of Misrule served as a master of ceremonies, leading processions of costumed revelers, initiating burlesque pantomimes that parodied the stiffness of royal courts, and even delivering saucy edicts that gently skewered political elites. The Stourbridge Fair, beyond Saints' Days. Every town and village had its own local festivals commemorating events like the anniversary of the parish church's consecration or the birth of a royal heir. Though smaller in scale than splashy tournaments or courtly banquets, these community gatherings fostered shared identity and relief from daily drudgery. One of the largest and most famous of these events was the Stourbridge Fair, held annually near the town of Cambridge, England. Originating way back in the early 1200s as a local gathering for farmers and tradesmen, the fair steadily grew over the centuries in both size and significance. By the late Middle Ages, merchants came from all over England and even from continental Europe to attend the Stourbridge Fair. For nearly a month, from late August to late September, the normally quiet meadows outside Cambridge transformed into a vast tented city alive with commerce and revelry. A Cowboys, Spanish visitor to the fair in the 1400s, marveled at the endless rows of stalls selling all manner of goods. Fine textiles, precious spices, handcrafted wares, barrels of wine and ale. It was like the entire world of trade condensed into a single time and place. Just imagine the sights and sounds of this sprawling fair at its peak. Everywhere, merchants and vendors would be calling out their wares, enticing passersby. Silks and satins, velvets and lace, the finest fabrics from Italy and the East. Spices from distant lands, cinnamon, pepper, cloves fit for a king's table. Meat as golden as the sun, ale as dark as night, wines to lift the spirit. Mingling with the shouts of sellers was the clamor of countless voices haggling over prices in a dozen languages and accents. The pungent scent of exotic spices mixed with the earthy smells of livestock, hay, and wood smoke from the food stalls. Minstrels and acrobats wove through the throngs, adding flashes of color and music to the bustling scene. The world of medieval gaming, when the weather turned foul or the mood struck for indoor entertainment. Medieval folk turned to games of chance and skill. From the humblest taverns to the halls of grand castles, the clatter of dice and chess pieces provided a lively soundtrack to medieval life. Master Aldrich and the game of King's Chess, known as the Game of Kings, attracted some of the most brilliant minds of the medieval period. Among these was Master Aldrich of Winchester, a monk who became renowned throughout England for his extraordinary skill at the checkerboard. Born in the year 1200 to a family of wool merchants, Aldrich showed an early aptitude for numbers and patterns that led his parents to dedicate him to the church. At the monastery of St. Swithin, young Aldrich discovered chess when a visiting bishop left behind an ivory set. The abbot, thinking games frivolous, ordered it locked away. But Aldrich was not so easily deterred. Night after night, he would slip from his cell to study the pieces by moonlight, teaching himself the moves through trial and error. Word of the young monk's unusual talent spread when he defeated a traveling master in a public match outside the cathedral. Soon, nobles were making pilgrimages to Winchester, not for spiritual guidance but for the chance to test their skill against the chess monk. Aldrich never refused a challenge, though he insisted that any winnings go to the monastery's fund for the poor. His most famous match occurred in 1234 against Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, who had wagered his finest destrier, a warhorse worth more than most peasants would see in a lifetime. The game lasted from dawn until dusk, with crowds gathering in the monastery courtyard to witness the Battle of Mind's Dot as evening shadows lengthened. Aldrich made a seemingly impossible move, sacrificing his queen to corner the Earl's king in a trap that had taken him hours to construct. The crowd gasped as Geoffrey studied the board, slowly realizing the elegant inevitability of his defeat. With grace befitting his rank, he conceded the match and presented the horse to the monastery, where it served faithfully for many years, carrying grain to the poor. Master Aldrich died at the age of 72, still undefeated in formal play. His chess set was buried with him, according to his wishes, but not before he had trained a dozen students in the subtle art of the game. His influence spread far beyond Winchester, establishing chess as not merely entertainment but as a tool for developing strategic thinking and patience. The Lewis Chessmen. The Lewis Chessmen remain one of the most intriguing puzzles of medieval gaming. When that Scottish farmer discovered them in 1831, he stumbled upon what many believed to be the property of Ragnar the Bold, a Norwegian merchant warrior of the late 12th century. Picture Ragnar as a man of considerable means, trading in amber, furs, and walrus ivory across the northern seas. His ship, the Sea-Wolf, was his pride, a sleek vessel that could outrun pirates and weather the worst storms. But Ragnar had a weakness for games of chance and skill, and he commissioned the chessmen as gifts for potential trading partners and allies. According to the Icelandic sagas, Ragnar was sailing from Trondheim to Dublin in the winter of 1189, when a terrible storm drove the Sea-Wolf toward the Scottish coast. As the ship foundered on the rocks near Lewis, Ragnar ordered his most precious cargo, the 4 chess sets, sealed in a leather chest and buried above the tide line, hoping to return for them once the storm passed. But Ragnar never made it off the island. Local legend says he and his crew were found frozen in a sea cave, victims of the brutal winter weather. The chess sets lay hidden for over 6 centuries, waiting for that farmer's plow to bring them back to light. Each set was slightly different, reflecting the various craftsmen who had worked on Ragnar's commission. The kings with their brooding expressions, the berserker warriors biting their shields in battle fury, the bishops with their contemplative poses, all captured the spirit of an age when the line between game and reality was often thin indeed. The Lewis chessmen, perhaps the most famous gaming relics to survive from the Middle Ages, are the Lewis chessmen. This intricately carved set of walrus ivory chess pieces was discovered on the Isle of Lewis, off the coast of Scotland in 1831. 93 pieces from 4 distinct sets were found, although who they belonged to remains a captivating mystery lost to time. The Lewis chessmen are believed to have been made in Trondheim, Norway, in the 12th century, based on their ornate Romanesque style. The kings, queens, bishops, knights, and warders are depicted as solemn figures sitting with swords across their laps or grasping their faces deep in thought. One can imagine a wealthy Norwegian noble commissioning the set, only to have them go missing on a voyage across the sea. Perhaps the superstitious crew cast an idolatrous chessman overboard, or maybe a merchant buried them for safekeeping during a storm, never to return. King Alfonso's Book of Games, one of the most chess-obsessed medieval monarchs, was King Alfonso X of Castile, also known as Alfonso the Wise. Alfonso was a renowned scholar and patron of the arts who wrote extensively on a wide range of topics including science, law, history, and music. In 1283, he commissioned the production of a lavishly illustrated manuscript called the Book of Games, or Libro de los Juegos in Spanish. The Book of Games is one of the most important sources we have on medieval games and their rules. It contains 97 pages of detailed descriptions and color illustrations of various games, primarily chess, dice, and tables. The chess problems in particular are highly advanced and complex, attesting to Alfonso's skill and passion for the game. Interestingly, the book also includes astrological charts, linking certain dice rolls to the influence of the planets and the zodiac. This reflects the medieval belief in the interconnectedness of all aspects of the cosmos, and how even seemingly random games of chance could be imbued with deeper symbolic meaning. The Venetian gambling houses, for those craving the atmosphere of a casino, one needed only to visit medieval Venice. It was there that the ridotto, or private gambling house, first emerged in the 13th century. These little houses of luck were early gambling halls where dice games and card games were played for high stakes. But before the famous ridotto was established, there existed smaller, more intimate gaming houses run by colorful characters who became legends in their own right. One such figure was Lorenzo, the Golden Dice, whose real name was Lorenzo Benedetti, a former silk merchant who discovered he had a greater talent for organizing games than selling fabric. Lorenzo's establishment, hidden away in a narrow alley behind the Rialto Bridge, became the most famous gambling den in all of Venice. Picture stepping through a heavy wooden door into a world of burgundy velvet curtains and Turkish carpets. The air thick with the scent of exotic spices and the sound of clinking coins. Lorenzo himself, a portly man with twinkling eyes and fingers heavy with rings, would greet each guest personally, his voice warm with the promise of fortune or folly. "Welcome, welcome, my friend," he would say in his melodious Venetian accent. "Tonight, perhaps Lady Luck will smile upon you. Or perhaps she will teach you the value of humility. Either way, you will remember this evening for years to come." Lorenzo had arrived in Venice as a young man from Milan, carrying nothing but a purse of silver coins and an uncanny ability to calculate odds. He started small, organizing dice games in tavern back rooms, but his reputation for fairness and his talent for creating an atmosphere of excitement soon drew the attention of wealthy merchants and even minor nobles. What set Lorenzo apart was his understanding that gambling was as much about theater as it was about chance. He hired musicians to play softly in the corners of his rooms, ensuring that every game was accompanied by a gentle melody that heightened the drama of each roll of the dice. Beautiful young women, dressed in the finest silks, served wine from crystal goblets and offered encouragement to nervous players. But Lorenzo's greatest innovation was the golden hour, a period just before midnight when he would bring out his most precious possession, a pair of dice carved from actual gold, inlaid with rubies where the pips should be. These dice, he claimed, had once belonged to a Byzantine emperor and carried within them the power to grant extraordinary fortune to those brave enough to wager with them. The legend of Lorenzo's Golden dice grew throughout Venice and beyond. Merchants would delay their departure for distant ports to try their luck with the magical cubes. Nobles would disguise themselves as commoners to slip into Lorenzo's establishment unrecognized. Even clergy, sworn to eschew such worldly pleasures, found excuses to venture into the dim, intoxicating atmosphere of the gambling house. Lorenzo's most famous patron was Countess Lucretia Dandolo, a widow of immense wealth who had inherited her late husband's fleet of trading vessels. The Countess was known throughout Venice for her beauty, her intelligence, and her absolutely terrible luck at games of chance. Week after week, she would arrive at Lorenzo's establishment with a purse full of gold ducats. And week after week, she would leave with empty pockets and a rueful smile. But the Countess never seemed discouraged by her losses. "Lorenzo," she would say, settling into her favorite chair beneath a painting of Venus rising from the sea, "I do not come here to win money. I come here to lose it in the most entertaining way possible. Your establishment provides a service far more valuable than mere gambling. You offer escape from the tedium of respectability." The relationship between Lorenzo and the Countess became one of the great talking points of Venetian society. Some whispered that they were lovers, others that Lorenzo deliberately ensured she lost to keep her returning. The truth, as Lorenzo himself confided to his closest associates, was simpler. The Countess genuinely enjoyed the thrill of risk, and he genuinely enjoyed providing her with the highest quality experience of losing money that could be found anywhere in the Mediterranean world. That their association came to an end in 1297 when the Countess, having finally exhausted even her vast fortune, made one final wager, her entire palazzo on the Canale Grande against Lorenzo's golden dice. The game was played before a crowd of the most prominent citizens of Venice, with the Doge himself serving as witness. For 3 hours, they played a complex card game of Lorenzo's own devising, each hand bringing gasps and cheers from the assembled crowd. As dawn approached, the final cards were revealed. The Countess had lost, but instead of tears or recriminations, she began to laugh. Great peals of delighted laughter that echoed through the palazzo. "Lorenzo, my dear friend," she said, embracing him warmly, "you have given me the greatest gift of all. You have shown me that losing everything can be just as thrilling as winning everything. I shall retire to my cousin's villa in the countryside and write my memoirs. And the first chapter shall be titled, 'The Night I Lost a Palace and Found True Freedom.'" Lorenzo closed his gambling house the following year, using his wealth to establish a charitable foundation that provided dowries for poor girls as support for widows. But the golden dice disappeared, and some say they still surface from time to time in the gaming houses of Europe, bringing extraordinary luck or devastating loss to those who dare to play with them. The life of a medieval minstrel. Few figures capture the romantic imagination of medieval life quite like the wandering minstrel. These traveling entertainers roamed the roads of Europe, bringing music, stories, and laughter to communities both grand and humble. But their lives were far from the romanticized tales we might imagine today. Brother Benedict the Balladrone's such figure who left his mark on history was a young 12th century Londoner named Benedict Lightwood. The son of a prosperous merchant, Benedict was a bright, charming lad with a quick wit and a flair for showmanship. As a youth, he earned his keep as a talented harpist and singer. Picture, if you will, a gangly, dark-eyed boy in a patched green tunic, his harp slung over his back as he wanders the muddy lanes of medieval London. With an impish grin, he sets up on a street corner and begins to play, his long, agile fingers dancing nimbly over the strings. His clear tenor voice rings out above the clamor of passing carts and barking dogs, weaving tales of heroic knights, fair maidens, and faraway lands. Soon a small crowd gathers around the young bard, entranced by his lyrics and lively melodies. Merchants toss him pennies, housewives offer him hunks of bread, and children caper merrily to his tunes. For a few enchanted moments, the drudgery of their lives is forgotten, replaced by the magic of Benedict's music. Word of the boy's talent eventually reached the ears of Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury. Impressed by Benedict's quick mind and courtly graces, Theobald took the young man under his wing, sending him off to study law and diplomacy at the universities of Paris and Bologna. Here, fate took an unexpected turn. Benedict's wit, intelligence, and charm won him the favor of the new king, Henry II. At just 36, Benedict found himself elevated to the lofty position of Lord Chancellor, becoming the king's chief advisor and right-hand man. The two were inseparable, bonding over a shared love of hunting, drinking, and carousing. It was said, only half-jokingly, that they had but one heart and one mind. But the merry partnership was not to last. When the old archbishop died in 1162, Henry appointed Benedict as his successor, assuming the worldly, pliable chancellor would do his bidding. Instead, Benedict underwent a dramatic transformation, casting off his fine silks for a hair shirt and devoting himself wholly to the church. As the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Benedict fiercely defended the rights and privileges of the clergy against the king's attempts to bring them under secular law. The once fast friends became the bitterest of enemies, locked in a titanic struggle for power that would convulse the realm. The feud came to a tragic head in 1170 when an enraged Henry, fuming over Benedict's latest act of defiance, rashly exclaimed, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 zealous knights, taking the king's words as a command, rode to Canterbury and brutally cut down the archbishop on the altar steps of his own cathedral. Christendom was aghast at the murder of an anointed prince of the church. Benedict was swiftly canonized as a martyr, and his shrine at Canterbury became a major pilgrimage site. The penitent Henry was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot to the tomb and submitting to a symbolic scourging by the monks. And so Benedict Lightwood, the merchant's son who began his journey as a common entertainer, ended it as a saint and a symbol of the eternal tug-of-war between church and state. The wandering minstrel. God wouldn't make peace but for every shooting star like Benedict. There were hundreds of nameless, forgotten minstrels eking out a precarious living on the roads of Europe. One such figure was Godwin Makepeace, whose very name seemed to mock the troubles that dogged his steps throughout a long and eventful life. Born sometime around 1200 in a village near Gloucester, Godwin was the 7th son of a blacksmith, a position that medieval superstition claimed gave him special powers. Though if such powers existed, they must have been for attracting misfortune rather than avoiding it. His parents, already struggling to feed 6 children, viewed young Godwin's arrival as one mouth too many at their table. When a traveling minstrel passed through their village when Godwin was barely 12 years old, his parents saw their opportunity. They approached the entertainer, an aging man called Hugh the Harper, and offered him their youngest son as an apprentice in exchange for a small payment and the promise that the boy would be taught a trade. Hugh was reluctant at first. He had grown tired of the wandering life and had been considering settling down in some monastery to spend his remaining years in contemplation rather than performance. But something about the boy's bright eyes and eager expression touched his heart. Perhaps it reminded him of his own youth, when the world had seemed full of possibilities rather than disappointments. And so Godwin began his education in the arts of entertainment. Under Hugh's patient tutelage, he learned to play the harp and the lute, to sing in the complex harmonies that audiences loved, and most importantly, to read the mood of a crowd and give them exactly what they wanted to hear. Hugh taught him that a successful minstrel was part musician, part actor, part psychologist, and part thief. You must steal their attention, the old man would say. Steal their hearts, steal their coins, but never steal their trust. For once you lose that, you lose everything. And in this business, you have nothing else. For 5 years, Godwin traveled with Hugh throughout England and into Wales, learning not just the technical skills of his trade, but the harder lessons of survival on the road. He learned which inns were safe and which harbored cutthroats, how to tell a story that would make a drunken crowd weep with emotion or roar with laughter, and how to disappear quickly when accusations of heresy or immorality began to fly. But in 1217, Hugh's age finally caught up with him. During a particularly harsh winter, while they were sheltering in a monastery near York, the old minstrel fell ill with a fever that refused to break. For days, Godwin tended his master, bathing his fevered brow and singing the gentle songs Hugh had taught him. But on the eve of the feast of St. Stephen, Hugh peacefully passed away, leaving Godwin alone in the world with nothing but a battered lute, a small collection of songs, and a hard-won knowledge of how to survive by his wits. The young minstrel might have settled down then, perhaps finding work as a clerk or servant in some lord's household. But the wandering life had gotten into his blood, and he found he could no more abandon the road than a fish could abandon water. So began Godwin's solo career, and with it, a series of adventures that would fill several books if anyone had bothered to write them down. There was the time he was accused of being a spy for the French and nearly hanged before proving his innocence through an impromptu performance of patriotic English ballads. There was the winter he spent snowed in at a castle in the Scottish borders, where he fell hopelessly in love with the lord's daughter, only to discover she was secretly married to his own squire. There was the strange affair of the Singing Stones of Glastonbury, where Godwin claimed to have learned ancient melodies from mysterious voices that emanated from the Abbey ruins at midnight. Whether this was truth, madness, or simply a clever marketing ploy, no one could say. But the songs he sang afterward were unlike anything anyone had heard before, haunting melodies that seemed to speak directly to the soul. Perhaps his most famous exploit occurred in 1234, during the reign of King Henry III. Godwin had arrived in London during a period of particular tension between the king and his barons. The city was full of armed men, suspicious glances, and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when strangers approached. Against all advice, Godwin decided to perform in the courtyard of Westminster Palace itself, reasoning that if he was going to be arrested as a suspicious character, he might as well be arrested for a performance worthy of royal attention. He positioned himself near the Great Hall just as the morning court session was ending and launched into a song he had composed specially for the occasion. The ballad told the story of a kingdom where the king and his nobles had forgotten that their true enemy was not each other, but the poverty and suffering of their people. It was a dangerous message, one that could easily be interpreted as criticism of the current political situation. But Godwin delivered it with such skill, weaving humor and pathos together so masterfully, that even the most hardened political adversaries found themselves listening with growing fascination. King Henry himself emerged from the hall to hear what was causing such a stir in his courtyard. For a tense moment, as the young king's eyes met those of the humble minstrel, it seemed that Godwin's career might end abruptly and permanently. But then Henry began to smile, then to chuckle, and finally to applaud. "Master Minstrel," the king called out, "you have given us all much to think about this day. We would have you stay and perform at our feast tonight. And perhaps tomorrow you might advise our counselors on the art of speaking truth and such, a way that it actually gets heard." That single performance transformed Godwin from a wandering entertainer into something approaching a court poet. For the next 3 years, he enjoyed the patronage of the king, living in comfort and security for the first time in his adult life. He composed songs for royal celebrations, entertained visiting dignitaries, and even served as an unofficial ambassador to Ireland, where his gift for languages and his non-threatening appearance as a mere entertainer allowed him to gather information and smooth over diplomatic difficulties. But comfort, Godwin discovered, was a dangerous thing for a man who had learned to thrive on uncertainty. As his life became more predictable, his art began to suffer. His songs lost their edge, their authenticity, their power to move hearts and change minds. He found himself becoming exactly what Hugh had warned him never to become, a mere ornament. A pretty voice that said what people wanted to hear rather than what they needed to hear. In 1237, Godwin made a decision that shocked the court and probably saved his soul. He quietly packed his few belongings, left a note of thanks for the king's patronage, and slipped away from Westminster in the early morning darkness, returning to the uncertain but honest life of the wandering road. He was never again to know the security of royal patronage, but his art was reborn. The songs he composed during his final 20 years of wandering are considered by scholars to be among the finest examples of medieval popular poetry. They speak with the voice of a man who had known both success and failure, comfort and hardship, and had chosen authenticity over ease. Godwin Makepeace died in 1259, found peacefully sleeping beside a country road in Herefordshire, his lute clutched to his chest and a smile on his weathered face. Local villagers said that for several nights after his burial, travelers on that road reported hearing faint music carried on the evening wind, a final performance from the minstrel who had learned that true success lay not in pleasing kings, but in touching human hearts. The feast culture of medieval courts. The nobility also enjoyed lavish feasts and banquets, which were a chance to showcase their wealth, power, and sophisticated tastes. The great halls of castles and manors would be decked out with embroidered tapestries, gleaming candelabras, and long tables covered in white linen. Master Gulam's culinary revolution amidst all the excess and grandeur of noble feasts. One quiet revolutionary was laying the foundations of modern French cuisine. Guillaume Terrel, better known as Talvent, served as master chef to no less than 3 French kings, Philip VI, Charles V, and Charles VI, between 1326 and 1395. Talvent's reputation was such that he was placed in charge of organizing the coronation feast of Charles V in 1364, which featured a staggering array of 66 dishes divided into 3 courses. Talvent is most famous for writing one of the earliest medieval cookbooks, called Le Viandier, which contained 230 recipes, ranging from simple dishes like omelets and vegetable soups to complex preparations of venison, boar, and other game meats. Talvent emphasized the importance of fresh ingredients, careful seasoning, and attractive presentation. He also began to codify the elaborate rituals and protocols of formal dining, such as the progression of courses, the pairing of dishes with sauces, and the art of carving meats. Some of Talvent's recipes seem strange and unappealing to modern tastes, such as the garbage, which was a stew made from the entrails and offal of various animals. Another dish was mill, which was a sweet and savory porridge of wheat, almonds, rice, cinnamon, saffron, and sugar, often dyed a vivid green color with parsley. Juice. The most infamous was cockatrice, a Frankenstein-esque creation made by stitching together the upper half of a capon with the bottom half of a piglet and coating it in egg yolk and saffron before roasting. However, many of Talvent's other recipes and techniques were well ahead of their time and laid the groundwork for the development of haute cuisine. He was one of the first chefs to recommend using butter and heavy cream to enrich and thicken sauces. He developed a precursor to the roux, the foundational mixture of butter and flour used to make sauces like bechamel and veloute. In a sense, Talvent was one of the world's first celebrity chefs, renowned for his artistry and skill, and setting the standard for generations of cooks to come after him. The common folk's simple pleasures. In the harsh and often short lives of medieval peasants, entertainment provided a rare respite from backbreaking toil and the ever-present specter of disease, famine, and violence. While the nobility had the leisure and wealth to indulge in more refined and extravagant amusements, even the lowest serfs found ways to infuse some merriment into their meager existence. One of the simplest, yet most beloved, peasant pastimes was dancing. On feast days and holidays, villagers would gather to perform lively jigs, reels, and circle dances accompanied by whatever makeshift instruments they could muster. Pipes, drums, fiddles played by itinerant minstrels, if they were lucky. There was little in the way of formal steps or choreography. These dances were free-form expressions of pure joy and communal celebration. For a few precious moments, the worries of the workaday world could be forgotten in a whirl of flailing limbs and stomping feet. Another, perennially popular diversion was the humble game of bowls. All that was needed was a relatively flat patch of ground and some rounded stones or wooden balls. Players would take turns tossing their balls, aiming to land them as close as possible to a smaller target ball called a jack or kitty. It was a game that could be enjoyed by young and old alike, men and women, making it a staple of village greens and taverns across Europe. The medieval mystery plays even in the humblest villages. A cherished feature of festivals was the mystery plays. These simple dramas reenacted stories from the Bible and lives of saints and martyrs. In the days before widespread literacy, mystery plays made religious narratives accessible to common people and provided rare opportunities for creative expression. Members of various trade guilds, the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, took responsibility for staging different episodes that matched their craft. So the shipbuilders might dramatize Noah's Ark, the vintners the wedding at Cana, and so on. The plays unfolded on wagons converted into makeshift stages that rolled through town, stopping at predetermined stations to perform each scene. Though the subject matter was sacred, that didn't prevent some unintentionally humorous moments. Since special effects were rather rudimentary, angels made do with chicken feathers glued to a white robe. Fiery helmets constructed of red-painted paper flapped open to receive the damned. An actor playing Herod might rant and rage only to get his fake beard stuck on his crown dot in the famous Second Shepherd's play. A thief trying to hide a stolen lamb from the suspicious shepherds tries to pass it off as a newborn baby. The mistaken identity hijinks must have had audiences in stitches. One can imagine a hard-working peasant guffawing in delight as Noah bickered with his mouthy wife, perhaps recognizing his own marital spats. Laughter, even its somewhat sacrilegious humor, provided a healing balm for lives that could often be nasty, brutish, and short. Seasonal celebrations and their customs, while Carnival brought a burst of festivity in late winter. Other celebrations were sprinkled throughout the medieval calendar. The Midsummer Feast of St. John the Baptist featured bonfires, dancing, and love divinations in many areas. Young women floated wreaths with candles on rivers and streams, hoping to glean clues about their future husbands from the flickering flames. If a girl's wreath sank, it was an ominous sign that she would not marry that year. Fragrant herbs like rosemary and St. John's wort were gathered and strewn about homes to ward off evil spirits. In an intriguing melding of pagan and Christian traditions, the magical plants were then saved and burned in the Yule log at Christmas. Speaking of magical plants, the autumn feast of St. Michael featured a perhaps surprising star, the humble carrot. Though a common vegetable now, carrots were a relative novelty in the Middle Ages after being introduced via Moorish Spain. Their sweet flavor and vivid orange color made them a great delicacy. At Michaelmas, women hoping to snag a husband were advised to sleep with a carrot under their pillow and recite, Saint Michael, my lover, you know well, by dreams let me see the youth that I shall marry. Apparently slumbering with a root vegetable was quite the aphrodisiac. If visions of Mr. Right failed to appear, at least the lady awoke to a handy snack. The enduring human spirit as we draw near the end of our look at the wild world of medieval pastimes and entertainments. It's fascinating to consider just how important a role these festivities played in the lives of people long ago. From spirited jousts to dizzying trade fairs, they offered not just diversion, but real meaning and much-needed breaks from the unrelenting labor and hardships that most endured. In a time before mass communication and easy travel, events like tournaments and festivals were cherished chances to come together as a community, to experience something new and exciting. The pageantry of a joust, the sensory overload of a fair, the bawdy antics of a jester, these joys were all the sweeter for their rarity. Of course, as with many aspects of history, we have to be careful not to over-romanticize the past. For the vast majority of people, leisure time was a luxury and daily survival a constant struggle. Many of the entertainments we've discussed were largely the preserve of the wealthy and privileged, and even the fun could be rough. Injuries and deaths were common at tournaments, and drunken brawls a regular occurrence at fairs. But that makes the resilience and ingenuity of medieval people all the more remarkable. In a world so full of obstacles and adversity, they still found ways to come together and celebrate, to infuse their difficult lives with color and excitement. Just like people in every place and period of history, they showed that indomitable human urge to make meaning and seek joy, even in the unlikeliest of circumstances. So while it's easy to dismiss the Middle Ages as a backward, barbaric time, the truth is always more complex. The more we learn about the beliefs, struggles, and daily experiences of medieval people, the more we may recognize some of our own hopes and fears reflected back at us. At the end of the day, across the vast gulf of centuries, they were not so different from us, just humans doing their best with the lot they were given, finding what joy and meaning they could along the way. A gentle farewell, and if our modern world, with all its wonders and conveniences, should ever feel too frenetic or frayed, perhaps we could learn a thing or two from our medieval ancestors about the simple pleasures of a bawdy story well told, or a lively tune played on a humble lute under an open sky. But for now, the sights and sounds of our imaginary Stourbridge Fair begin to gently recede as weariness draws its soft cloak about us. The bright banners and tents fade into twilight shadows. The shouts and laughter of the fairgoers muffled to a distant murmur. Rest now, weary time traveler, and may your dreams be filled with the vivid colors and merry melodies of a world long past, but never truly lost. Good night. Kings and commoners alike shared in the collective catharsis of carnival frolics, midsummer merriment, and homespun harvest gaiety. So when your days feel dreary and your spirits sag, just remember those tenacious medieval merrymakers. With a candlelit wreath, a sugary sculpture, or a lamb standing in for the baby Jesus, they found reasons to revel in the toughest of times. Weary serf and haughty duke alike cherished their hard-won holidays. Perhaps some similar silliness is in order. Grab a carrot for your pillow and invoke the power of St. Michael's love magic. Appoint a pal as Lord of Misrule and issue some mock edicts. A little festive foolery might be just the pick-me-up a trying day demands. The tavern culture, gaming and gambling. Speaking of taverns, these establishments were the closest thing most medieval peasants had to an entertainment venue. After a long day in the fields, men would gather to quaff ale, swap stories, sing bawdy songs, and perhaps engage in some friendly wagering on dice or card games. Gambling with dice had been popular since ancient Roman times, and the medieval version wasn't much different. Simply toss the dice and hope that your number comes up. Not exactly Vegas, but it added an extra thrill to the night's revelry. Picture a cramped, dimly lit room packed with boisterous patrons, a virtual rogues gallery of cutpurses, sailors, apprentices, and wayward clerics, their faces flickering in the light of guttering tallow candles. In one corner, a grizzled man-at-arms rolls his remaining dice with a trembling hand, the last of his wages riding on this final toss. In another, a group of rascally students cluster over a game of fox and geese, their whoops of triumph and howls of despair punctuating the merry din. The harried tavern keeper scurries to and fro with foaming flagons of ale, pausing only to cuff the ears of a stable boy filching hazelnuts from a bowl. Yes, it's a far cry from the glittering castle banquet hall, but you can't beat it for a good night out. The perils of medieval gambling. But gambling wasn't just a harmless hobby. It could be downright dangerous in the Middle Ages. In 1190, the King of France and the King of England got into a row over a particularly heated dice game and nearly came to blows. Talk about royal temper tantrums. One can only imagine the poor quaking page who had to break up that spat. But it seems the French never learned their lesson. A few centuries later, King Henry IV of France once lost an entire district of Paris in a single roll of the dice. Now that's what I call high-stakes gambling. Indeed, such wagers can have far-reaching consequences. According to medieval chroniclers, the region of Morton in Normandy got its name from a very unlucky throw of the dice. The story goes that Duke William of Normandy lost the county to his brother Robert during a game and exclaimed in French, "Mal tenu," meaning badly held. Whether a tall tale or true story, it certainly proves that when it came to dicing, the stakes didn't get much higher than a chunk of the duchy. The art of courtly entertainment, but man cannot subsist on dice alone. So all this gaming would work up a mighty hunger and powerful thirst. No worries though, for the average tavern offered a lip-smacking array of hearty fare to keep those gamblers going. A typical spread might include crusty manchet bread, zesty cheese, and perhaps a leek pottage, all washed down with quarts of strong brown ale. And if you were feeling particularly flush, you might splash out on a roasted capon or savory meat pie. Just be sure to keep one eye on your trencher and the other on your purse, lest some light-fingered rogue make off with your supper or your steaks. But gaming wasn't the only entertainment on offer at your local medieval watering hole. If you were lucky, a wandering minstrel might drop by to ply his trade, brightening up the evening with sprightly tunes and stirring tales of heroic deeds. A skilled recounting of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight could make you forget the flea bites and watered-down wine. For a little while anyway. Other nights you might be treated to the antics of a jester or a troupe of tumblers, their daring acrobatics and ribald japes coaxing chuckles and cheers from even the most door-faced patrons. Of course, such diversions were not without risk. One false move and an ambitious acrobat could wind up face first in a patron's pottage. I imagine more than one unwary pope or lofty lord found himself wearing his soup after a juggling feat gone awry. The spectacle of dancing bears, but no form of medieval tavern entertainment, could top the spectacle of the dancing bear. That's right. For a few coins, you could watch a shaggy, hulking beast lumber and sway to the mournful strains of a hurdy-gurdy. Just how the bear felt about his part in the act remains a historical mystery, but one suspects even the promise of a sticky bun or two failed to erase the indignity of it all. Indeed, animal welfare was not exactly top priority. In the Middle Ages, a tavern, bears were downright domesticated compared to the ferocious creatures stalked by noble hunters in the wild woods beyond the castle. Walls dot the rise of professional entertainment as the medieval period progressed. Entertainment became increasingly sophisticated and professional. Troubadours and minstrels formed guilds, codifying their art and establishing standards for performance. The most successful could earn substantial livings, traveling from court to court and building reputations that lasted generations. The courtly love tradition, the tradition of courtly love poetry, pioneered by troubadours in southern France, transformed entertainment into high art. These poet-musicians didn't merely sing for their supper. They created elaborate, artistic works that explored themes of romance, chivalry, and spiritual longing. Consider the famous troubadour Bernard de Ventador, who became one of the most celebrated poets of the 12th century. Born the son of a castle baker, Bernard's musical gifts elevated him far beyond his humble origins. Legend tells us that he fell hopelessly in love with Eleanor of Aquitaine, the powerful queen consort who's patron to many troubador, as picture young Bernard, barely 20 years old, standing in the great hall of Eleanor's court at Poitiers. The flickering candlelight catches the gold threads in the tapestries as nobles in rich silks gather around to hear his latest composition. His lute strings shimmer as his fingers find the opening chords, and then his voice rises in a song that speaks of longing so pure it transforms earthly desire into spiritual devotion. "The lark that rises joyful to the light," he begins, his melody weaving through the hall like incense. The assembled courtiers lean forward, drawn into his web of words that speak of love so refined, so elevated, that it becomes a path to divine understanding. But Bernard's devotion to Queen Eleanor proved his undoing. When rumors of their affair reached the ears of her husband, King Louis VII, the troubadour was banished from court. He spent his remaining years wandering from castle to castle, his songs growing ever more melancholy as he aged. His final composition, written shortly before his death, spoke of a love that burns but never consumes, wounds but never kills, and makes the lover both the happiest and most miserable of men. The tragic tale of Blanche the Storyteller, another figure who exemplified the precarious life of medieval entertainers, was Blanche de Castile, though not the famous queen of that name, but rather a humble storyteller who adopted the noble moniker to add weight to her performances. Born Marie Lebrun in a small village outside Paris, she transformed herself into one of the most sought-after entertainers of the 13th century. Blanche specialized in tales of courtly romance and adventure, but with a twist. She told them from the perspective of the women in the stories. Where other minstrels sang of brave knights rescuing damsels, Blanche spun yarns of clever princesses who rescued themselves, of wise queens who outwitted their enemies through cunning rather than force. Picture her arriving at a manor house on a snowy winter evening, her wagon pulled by a single tired horse, her few possessions bundled in colorful cloths. Despite her modest appearance, when she began to speak, magic filled the air. Her voice could become the whisper of a forest fairy or the roar of a dragon. Her gestures painted pictures more vivid than any tapestry. Blanche's most famous story was the tale of Lady Moonbeam, about a princess who disguised herself as a knight to compete in tournaments. Night after night, she would defeat the greatest warriors in the realm, always disappearing before dawn. The story delighted noble ladies who saw themselves in the clever heroine, while the men remained blissfully unaware of the tale's subversive message. But Blanche's success bred jealousy among male minstrels who felt their territory invaded. They spread rumors that she was a witch, that her stories contained hidden spells. In 1268, during a performance at the castle of Count Thibaut of Champagne, she was accused of heresy. The Count, fearing for his own reputation, ordered her arrested. She died in prison 3 months later, never having been formally tried. Yet her stories lived on, passed from mother to daughter in whispered tellings that kept alive the memory of a woman who dared to imagine a world where feminine wisdom was valued above masculine strength. The evolution of dramatic art's mystery plays, as we've discussed, were one of the most important forms of medieval drama. But as cities grew and became more prosperous, dramatic entertainment evolved as well. Guild-sponsored plays became more elaborate, with increasingly sophisticated staging, costumes, and special effects. The famous Corpus Christi cycles in cities like York and Chester featured dozens of individual plays, performed throughout the day, telling the entire story of Christian salvation from creation to the Last Judgment. These weren't amateur affairs, but carefully orchestrated productions involving hundreds of performers and extensive preparation. Each guild took responsibility for plays that related to their trade. The shipwrights performed Noah's Flood, complete with an actual working ark. The goldsmiths presented the Adoration of the Magi, showcasing their finest wares as the gifts of the wise men. The bakers staged the Last Supper, naturally providing the bread. These plays served multiple functions. They entertained the crowds, educated the largely illiterate population about Christian doctrine, and allowed the guilds to display their wealth and skill. The best productions became sources of civic pride, drawing visitors from neighboring towns and boosting local commerce. The tournament, as theater tournaments, evolved far beyond simple martial contests to become elaborate theatrical productions. By the late medieval period, they incorporated complex narratives, allegorical themes, and spectacular visual displays that rivaled any other form of entertainment. The most famous example was the Tournament of the Round Table held by King Edward III at Windsor Castle in 1344. This wasn't just a series of jousts, but an immersive theatrical experience that transported participants and spectators into the world of Arthurian romance. The tournament ground was transformed into a replica of Camelot, complete with a massive round table and elaborate set pieces. Knights didn't simply compete. They took on the personas of Arthurian characters, following storylines that unfolded over several days. Spectators weren't merely watching athletic contests, but participating in a shared fantasy that brought legendary heroes to life. The pas d'armes. Even more theatrical form of tournament was the pas d'armes, or passage of arms. In these events, a knight or group of knights would take up a defensive position, perhaps guarding a bridge or castle gate, and challenge all comers to dislodge them. These events were often tied to specific narratives. The defenders might claim to be protecting a damsel in distress or guarding a magical relic. Challengers had to accept the premise of the story and play their assigned roles. Success wasn't measured simply by martial skill, but by how well participants embodied their characters and advanced the narrative. The most elaborate pas d'armes could last for weeks, drawing challengers from across Europe. They combined the excitement of athletic competition with the immersive experience of what we might now call live-action role-playing. The feast as performance. Art medieval feasts, especially at the highest levels of society, were carefully choreographed performances that combined culinary artistry with dramatic spectacle. These weren't simply meals, but multimedia entertainment, experiences that engaged all the senses. The famous Feast of the Pheasant, hosted by Duke Philip the Good in 1454, exemplified this tradition. Each course was accompanied by dramatic presentations, musical performances, and elaborate tableaux. Giant pies opened to reveal orchestras of musicians. Mechanical devices created moving scenes that illustrated moral or political themes. The climax came when a live pheasant, adorned with a jeweled collar, was brought before the Duke. This wasn't merely an exotic dish, but a symbolic centerpiece around which the entire evening's entertainment was structured. Philip's vow to crusade made over the pheasant, transformed a dinner party into a moment of high political theater. The art of subtleties. Even the food itself became a form of entertainment. Subtleties, elaborate edible sculptures that adorned medieval tables, were marvels of both culinary and artistic skill. These might depict entire battle scenes, complete with tiny soldiers made of sugar and marzipan, or recreate famous buildings in pastry and spun sugar. Master chefs like Guillaume Tailvant didn't just feed their patrons, but amazed them with displays of technical virtuosity. A single subtlety might take weeks to plan and days to execute, requiring the skills of sculptors, painters, and confectioners working in concert. The presentation of these culinary masterpieces was itself theatrical. Subtleties were carried into the hall in processions, accompanied by fanfares and announced by heralds. Guests were expected to admire and discuss them before the actual eating began, making them conversation pieces as much as food. The calendar of celebration medieval life was structured around a complex calendar of religious and secular celebrations, each with its own traditions and forms of entertainment. This rhythm of feast and fast, work and celebration gave shape and meaning to the medieval year. The Christmas season, extending from Christmas Eve through Epiphany, was the longest continuous period of celebration in the medieval calendar. During these 12 days, normal social hierarchies were relaxed or even inverted. The Feast of Fools on January 1st saw cathedral choristers electing a boy bishop who presided over mock religious services. Lords of misrule took charge of noble households, organizing games, pranks, and general merriment. The celebration of Twelfth Night marked the climax of the Christmas season with elaborate entertainments that might include masks, dances, and theatrical performances. The tradition of the Twelfth Night cake, containing a bean that made its finder king or queen for the evening, democratized the festivities and ensured that even humble servants might rule over their betters for a night. Easter and spring festivals. Easter brought its own cycle of celebrations, beginning with the somber observances of Lent but culminating in the joyous festivities of Easter Sunday and the following weeks. Easter plays, depicting the resurrection and its aftermath, became major community events that combined religious devotion with dramatic entertainment. May Day celebrations welcomed spring with outdoor festivities that drew on both Christian and pre-Christian traditions. The election of May Queens, the dancing around maypoles, and the gathering of spring flowers created a carnival atmosphere that celebrated renewal and fertility. Harvest festivals. Autumn brought harvest festivals that celebrated the completion of agricultural work and the security of food for the coming winter. These were perhaps the most genuinely popular celebrations, as they involved entire communities regardless of social status. Harvest home celebrations featured communal feasts where everyone contributed according to their means. The last sheaf of grain was often made into a corn dolly or other decorative figure that was paraded through the village and then kept as a talisman for the next year's crop. The legacy of medieval entertainment. As we reach the end of our journey through the world of medieval entertainment, it's worth reflecting on how these ancient forms of amusement continue to influence our modern world. Many of our contemporary entertainments can trace their roots back to medieval innovations and traditions. The tournament, with its combination of athletic competition and dramatic spectacle, prefigured both modern sports and professional wrestling. The elaborate pageantry, the development of fan culture, and even the commercial sponsorship that characterizes modern athletics all have medieval precedents. Medieval drama, from mystery plays to courtly entertainments, laid the groundwork for all subsequent theatrical traditions. The idea that performance could educate as well as entertain, that it could explore complex moral and philosophical questions while providing spectacular visual experiences, remains central to dramatic art. Even our festival culture owes much to medieval traditions. The combination of community celebration, commercial activity, and entertainment that characterizes modern festivals from Oktoberfest to Burning Man reflects patterns established in medieval fairs and celebrations. The human constant. Perhaps most importantly, medieval entertainment reveals the constants of human nature that transcend historical periods. The desire for community, the need for escape from daily drudgery, the pleasure taken in skill and artistry, the delight in storytelling and shared fantasy. These impulses are as strong today as they were 1,000 years ago. The medieval peasant dancing around a maypole, the knight performing in a tournament, the noble enjoying an elaborate feast, the merchant haggling at a fair while watching a juggler, all were satisfying the same basic human needs that drive our modern entertainment choices. The forms may change, but the underlying motivations remain remarkably consistent. In our age of digital entertainment and global connectivity, we might learn from the medieval emphasis on community participation and shared experience. Medieval entertainment was rarely passive consumption, but active participation in communal activities that strengthened social bonds and cultural identity. A final medieval night. And so, As the candles burn low and the last echoes of minstrel songs fade into memory, we take our leave of the medieval world of entertainment. We've witnessed knights charging across tournament fields, merchants haggling at bustling fairs, nobles feasting in candlelit halls, and common folk dancing around village greens. We've met remarkable individuals like Sir Edmund the Bold, who rose from obscurity to tournament fame, Lady Isabella of Burgundy, whose love of hunting led to her tragic end, Brother Benedict, the former minstrel, who became a martyred archbishop, and Master Guillaume, whose culinary innovations influenced cuisine for centuries. We've explored the grand spectacles of Burgundian carnivals and the simple pleasures of tavern games, the sophisticated artistry of troubadour poetry, and the earthy humor of mystery plays. Through it all, we've seen how medieval people, despite facing hardships we can barely imagine, found ways to celebrate life, create beauty, and build communities of shared joy. Their legacy lives are not just in historical records, but in the continued human impulse to gather, celebrate, compete, create, and find meaning through shared entertainment. Whether we're watching a sporting event, attending a festival, playing a game, or simply enjoying a meal with friends, we're participating in traditions that stretch back through centuries to those long-ago medieval entertainers who understood that life, however difficult, must also include moments of wonder, laughter, and delight. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the pageantry of tournaments, the melodies of ancient songs, and the warmth of communal celebration that made even the darkest medieval nights bright with human fellowship. In the morning, when you wake to our modern world, perhaps you'll carry with you a bit of that medieval spirit, the knowledge that entertainment is not mere frivolity, but an essential part of what makes us human. And with that gentle thought, we bid farewell to the Middle Ages and return you to your own time, enriched by this glimpse into the wild and wonderful ways our ancestors found to make their lives a little brighter, a little more magical, and a little more worth living. Good night, and sweet medieval dreams.